We'll start, though, with Sarah Corker and the cladding story. And every time I think I've got to grips with the full horror of this story, another more horrific aspect of it takes shape in front of my eye. And this is what we're talking about today. It's about shared affordable housing schemes, shared ownership schemes. Five Live Money's Sarah Corker joins us. So just take us back a bit, Sarah, to how all this started.
Yeah, hi there, Adrian. So if we rewind to 2017, concerns about building safety were triggered by the Grenfell Tower tragedy, and the subsequent inquiry found that the external cladding on that tower block was blamed for the rapid spread of the fire. So after that, there were safety checks on other high-rise blocks across the UK. And since then, the issues have spiralled, really. And today, this is a figure for you, it's estimated more than 500,000 people are still living in homes wrapped in some kind of dangerous materials. Now, not everyone is eligible for government funding to fix the buildings. And so flat owners, leaseholders are facing these life-changing bills, tens of thousands of pounds in some cases. And often those who have bought on these affordable housing schemes designed for people on low incomes, they are the ones that say they're really feeling the brunt of this, and they just do not have the money to even consider trying to pay to fix the external wall.
OK, so if you own or you're the leaseholder, which is kind of de facto the same thing, but so if you bought a flat and it's 100% yours, albeit as a leaseholder, then I can, unfair though it is, you can understand why you'd be liable for all of your share of the cost. What I don't get is with these share ownership schemes, if you only own, say, 30% of your place and the other 70% owned generally by a housing association, then I don't understand why, if you only own 30%, your limit to your liability isn't 30% of the cost.
Yeah, and you're not the only one.
It's bizarre.
You're not the only one questioning that logic. And as you say, the way it works is people often own this minority share. They then pay rent on the bit that they don't own to a housing association. But it's the terms of the lease that mean that these people are liable for 100% of the maintenance of the cladding costs. And that is legally binding. It's part of that lease. But you speak to many people who have bought through shared ownership, and they will say, never in a million years would I have ever signed up to this scheme if I'd known that I would have been on the hook for these types of bills, for essentially what is major construction work in some cases, where entire walls have to come down and be replaced, and the costs are just astronomical, completely unaffordable. And I've been looking at all these issues for more than a year now, and I've been following the story of one lady, she's called Emma Lee, a mum of two from South London. She bought a one-bed flat 2 years ago, and have a listen to her story.
So if you look at all the timber cladding that you see, that all has to come down.
Because it doesn't meet regulations?
Doesn't meet regs.
And when you moved in, this was all brand new, wasn't it?
Brand spanking new, yeah. This was supposed to be like a stepping stone for us, our kind of first homes on the property ladder. Yeah, and now we've just been kind of stuck, and yeah, we're facing really high bills that are gonna practically like destroy our lives.
And you bought through the government shared ownership scheme. So just spell out for me what proportion of the flat you own, but what proportion of the repair costs you have to pick up.
So I own 50% of my flat, but one of the catches in shared ownership, I am 100% responsible for anything that happens with my flat. I don't think shared ownership is fit for purpose. It's to help people like me who couldn't afford to get, a full mortgage on a property. So I'm on universal credit. Every penny literally counts.
So I think you can hear there just how powerless Emma feels. And I've been speaking to housing experts and consumer groups, and they've all told me that in light of the cladding crisis, it's really highlighted some of the flaws in the shared ownership model, and they say it needs to be reformed.
So what do the housing associations have to say about this?
Yeah, well, I've been speaking to shed owners across the country. Lots of people have been getting in touch, and they've said they're deeply unhappy with how their housing associations are dealing with these issues. Poor communication, lack of transparency over these costs. Also, in some cases, a refusal to share fire risk assessments and surveys. These are all common complaints. Housing associations have said, look, we're in a really difficult position, actually, because money diverted to improve building safety is taking away our ability to build new affordable homes as a result. And they've actually said it will mean across the UK, nearly 1 in 10 new affordable homes won't be built over the next 5 years as a result. So they're facing some really difficult choices, but saying that they've reiterated safety of residents is their top priority. And what they want the government to do is to fund all these fire safety works up front and then ask the government to recoup the money from developers who may have cut corners at the time or are responsible for the faults. But at the moment, these solutions are really difficult and costly, and no one can really agree on who should actually foot the bill.
So there's no... They don't acknowledge the moral argument that, unfair though it is, they should be paying their part of the cost related to the flat they effectively own.
They're saying that they are putting lots of money already into fixing fire safety faults, but that the bill is so huge that they can't possibly, as a housing association, fund all of these costs. They have got, as you can imagine, social housing tenants as well, renters. So they're fixing the costs for people in those properties. But when it comes to leaseholders, legally, the terms of the lease mean that they have to stump up the money. And I think the issue is the government's response to all of this. There is a fund, £5 billion, to remove cladding on the highest risk blocks. So buildings apply to that fund. Nearly 3,000 of them have applied so far, and work is starting on many of them. But for buildings like Emma, this is an extra layer of all of this, hope you're still with me, buildings like Emma's are under 18 metres, so they are not eligible for this government funding. And here is where the problem lies. There's a £5 billion government fund, but MPs have actually estimated this is a £15 billion problem. So there's a shortfall in the funding.
So Adina Pressman bought her flat in Elephant and Castle in London in 2008 and owns a 35% share of it. And Adina joins us now. So thanks for coming on. So the other 65% is owned by whom?
Oh, hello. It's actually 25% that I own.
Right, okay.
And so my housing association, who's called Optivo, they own the other 75%. And the other distinction to make is that I'm a leaseholder of the flat only. Optivo own the building, and they make it very clear that we don't have any rights over the building at all, that we're not allowed to put a doormat outside our door or a picture on the wall or anything. So I don't understand why we should pay anything for the building. We don't, apart from the fact that shared ownership, as you say, is a complete misnomer, because we don't own anything, and they're certainly not sharing anything with us. We've been given, in my block, we've been given a £2.6 million bill to share between our block, which is working out at £85,000 for each flat. So I've been given a bill for £85,000. Now, my 25% share originally involved a £90,000 mortgage.
Right.
So I just feel like they basically, they told me this was affordable housing. I'm a teacher in a primary school. I was told that this was going to be affordable housing for me to be able to stay in London and do the work that obviously the government want us to do. That's why they're making affordable housing for key workers. And yet, and then they say this is an investment for your future. Now my investment is nothing. It's worth nothing. The only way I could afford to pay £85,000 is to sell my flat, and you can't sell the flats at the moment because they're not fire safe. Mm-hmm. So they will have to repossess all of our flats in order to get the money.
So I just want to check I understand this. So like you own at 35%. 20, sorry, so I keep saying 25% of your flat,
Yeah.
and you owe £85,000. If you owned 100% of your flat, you would also owe £85,000.
Yeah, because the lease basically says
Yeah.
that they can charge you any amount for anything they want at any time.
Even though they're effectively own 75% of your property themselves. So what? So I mean, they will say this was in the small print. I suppose, was it ever pointed out to you by, I don't know, your solicitor or whatever when you bought
absolutely.
the place?
I mean, I read my lease before I signed it. I just, it's social housing, it's affordable housing. I assumed that they were talking about when we need to paint the outside of the building, we might give you a bill for £1,000 or £800 or something. It never in a million years occurred to me they were going to give us a bill for £85,000, because obviously how are we going to pay it? We're key workers. We're low paid key workers. That was the criteria for getting on the scheme, is that you're low paid key workers. So it doesn't make sense, and it's really, really unfair.
Okay, to stay with us if you can, Gareth Shaw joins us. He's head of money at the consumer group Which. Gareth, Adina's story, you've heard it a number of times now. What do you suggest?
I mean, I have a huge amount of sympathy for Adina and thousands of other people in a similar situation. It cannot be that blameless victims of the cladding crisis are forced to foot the entirety of the bill. And for people particularly on low incomes for whom affordable housing was the only really way that they could get themselves onto the home ownership ladder, this is a really cruel irony.
All right, affordable housing is kind of one thing, and part of that is shared ownership, which we are talking specifically about here. So you've got an affordable place, but you own it. Is possibly affordable only because you're allowed to buy just a percentage of it.
Absolutely, yeah. And, Adina was just talking about being a key worker there. This it is a route for people. In previous case study, he was talking about being on universal credit. This is a route for people on lower incomes who can't afford to put together a full 10% deposit on a property to get onto the property ladder. As I was saying, it's a really cruel irony that the people who can least afford to foot these bills are now being asked to pay a huge amount of money. Now, that there are legislative options here that can help find a solution. There's the fire safety bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment, which has stopped short of promising that leaseholders will not have to foot the bill. There's also leasehold reform legislation going through as well, and that feels like an opportunity to try and address some of the inequities in the leasehold market that makes leaseholders liable for radical maintenance. As Adina was saying, more than prepared to pay £1,000 to repaint a building, but talking about ripping cladding off a building and replacing it, or filling cavity walls, or all of the myriad of other issues that people in high-rise buildings are facing. That is not what people were expecting to be paying for. So there are legislative opportunities for the government to address it. It just remains to be seen whether or not they take those.
But none of that addresses the central unfairness, is that the people with whom you share ownership of a property, while you share the ownership with them, you don't share the costs associated with that. I mean, that would seem. I mean, that's the specific issue here.
It is the most controversial issue here. Why hasn't there been a direction? There have been nudges and encouragements for developers and for housing association and for freeholders to avoid pushing the costs onto leaseholders. But there's been nothing explicit because of the legal position. You signed up for you're legally bound to meet these costs. And some of the arguments have been that housing associations that are not for profit simply cannot use their funds to pay for this remediation because of the other obligations that they have. So that there is a huge amount of legal complexity within this that could be remedied if one of the solutions which was mentioned earlier was put forward, which is that the government funds all of the changes and then finds a way to recoup that money. Now, it is going to be looking to raise revenue from developers, for example, through a levy. But that is one of the most compelling options out there, is that all of the changes are paid for and then a way of getting that money back is figured out.
So Ken has texted in, says, my bank isn't liable for cladding on the house, so why should the government, or I think he means housing association maybe, so in the shared ownership scheme, be when they're basically just acting as a money lender? Well, I think the difference is with the mortgage, you do actually own the house, albeit secured against, and the house itself is security for the loan from the bank. That's the difference. I mean, here, you don't own the whole house. You only own 35% of the house or the flat in this case. That's the difference, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yes, it is. And look, you can argue about who should be footing the bill. I think ultimately these buildings were manufactured in a way that have got safety issues. So one would look all the way up to the developers. They would push back down on that as well and say in some cases we were only following the rules that we had to follow at the time. But it's absolutely clear who shouldn't be on the hook for this, and that is blameless victims in this, leaseholders who have had no say in how that building was put together, have had no say in the type of cladding that was used, cannot be put at fault for this, and therefore shouldn't have to foot the bill for it.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much indeed. That's Gareth Shaw from the Consumer Group, which Adina Pressman we heard from Elephant and Castle, and also our specialist in this area, Sarah Corker from 5 Live Money.